They definitely get the chaotic and dangerous feeling of Magic down pretty well with this system, but it's a bit different than some of the other systems that you may be used to with D&D 5e. There are 2 spellcasting classes in Shadowdark. Well, technically there's 3, but the Bard's a little bit weird, so I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But there's 2 main spellcasting classes, and that is the Wizard and the Priest. I don't know why I'm counting like this. The Wizard and the Priest. I'm American. This is how we count. When you want to cast a spell, you make a spellcasting check. Pretty simple. All you do if you're a wizard is you roll your intelligence plus any extra modifiers that you may get. And with a priest, you roll your wisdom plus any other modifiers that you may get. Some of the other modifiers would be things like your talents. If you roll some of the different talents, you may get a +1 to your spellcasting, or I believe it's the elf gets a +1 to their spellcasting, or, ranged attacks, but if you're a spellcaster, you're probably going to take spellcasting. So most of the spellcasters I usually see have anywhere from a +4 to a +7 at earlier levels for their spellcasting checks, and all you need to do is beat the spellcasting DC, and you cast the spell. The spellcasting DC is determined by the tier of the spell. If you're used to 5e, that's basically the spell level. So for a tier 1 spell, it is 11 because it is 10 plus the tier of the spell. For a tier 4 spell, the DC would be a 14. Pretty simple. Now, where this gets some of the unpredictability and chaotic nature is because you don't actually have spell points, spell slots, mana, anything like that. If you pass your spellcasting check, spell goes off, no resources consumed. If you fail your check, though, you can't cast that spell again for the rest of the day. That means that your wizard could fail all their spellcasting checks and not be able to cast a single spell all day. It could also mean that they're just sitting there blasting magic missiles and stuff off all session long, never fail, and it seems like they have unlimited spells. I've pretty much seen both of those happen where a player may roll super well one session and they only fail like one spellcasting check all day, and I've seen one. I've literally had a wizard fail every single check, and first fight pretty much they don't have any spells left, and they're just sitting there trying to stab the monster with a dagger, which is not ideal for your wizard to be doing. Now, something to know is unlike 5e or some other systems, you don't make a spell attack. You don't do it. If you want to roll acid arrow or something like that, if your spell goes off, it automatically hits, which is really nice if you're facing someone with a really high AC, because all you have to do is just get your spell off and you know it's going to hit. On the flip side, if you're facing someone with a low AC, it doesn't exactly make them easier to hit. It's the exact same. But that's magic. It's unpredictable, it's chaotic, and it can be really powerful. Now, something else to know is not only are there no spell attacks, most spells don't have a save DC or anything associated with them. If you use Burning Hands, if you get the spell off, it's hitting everyone in that area. There is no save. They take the full damage if they get hit by it. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat on that. That's for the damage spells. There isn't typically a save to have the damage or anything like that. If it goes off, they take the damage. But obviously, there are a lot of utility spells, and those are a little bit different. Hold Person, for example, that's a tier 2 wizard spell. So you make a spell casting check, you need to roll at least a 12 or higher. You successfully do so, and it will work unless the monster is level 4 or higher. Really, I should be saying creature, unless the creature is level 4 or higher. And if you're used to 5e, monsters don't have CR. They use levels to denote how powerful they are. Now, there are certain spells that will have saves. So, as I'm just looking at that section of the spells, Hold Portal, for example, will hold a portal shut, but they can make a strength check to open it. Now, the DC that they need to beat to stop one of your spells is what you roll. So for Hold Portal, that's a level 1 spell, so it would be at least an 11, because if you rolled less than that, the spell doesn't even go off. But you might have rolled a 19, which means they now need to roll at least a 19 to break open their portal that you are using Hold Portal on. But it gets better. Obviously, you're rolling a d20 for all of your spells to see if you can cast it or not. So that means we have nat 20s and nat 1s, critical success and critical failures. On a critical success or a nat 20, you can double one of the numerical effects from the spell. So if it's something that lasts a certain amount of rounds, you can double how long the spell lasts. If it's a damage spell, you can double the damage of the spell. With a nat 1, though, The wizards I like more. The priest is you just can't cast that spell again until you complete a penance, which might be sacrificing gold, things like that, or doing a deed to appease your deity so that you can cast that spell again. Not really my favorite, but the wizards get a role on the mishap table. There's different tables depending on the tier of the spell that you're casting. So the first mishap table that you'll see will be the tier 1 to tier 2 mishaps. And there's a bunch of different fun effects that you can see on there. Here I'll share on the screen so you can read through some of the tier 1 and 2 mishaps that can happen on a nat 1. There's a tier 3 and 4 table, and then a tier 5 table, and then there are no spells higher than tier 5, at least right now. There may be modules that come out with some higher level spells. Now there's one other thing that you need to know as far as just casting spells work, and that is focus, which is the equivalent of concentration from 5e. While it's very similar, there's a couple differences that make it a little bit more challenging and focus spells a little harder to maintain. If something happens that could distract you, an earthquake, you fall off your horse, whatever, you have to do a check to see if you maintain focus. All that is very similar to D&D if you're familiar with their concentration system. But there's an extra little difference on this, and that is that at the start of every one of your turns, you also have to roll. So you are guaranteed to be making at least one focus check every round. And the DC is higher. With D&D, where it's always a DC 10 to maintain concentration, with this, you just have to pass your spellcasting check again. So if you're focusing on a tier 3 spell, the DC is a 13, and modifiers are often lower in this, so it is harder to maintain focus, and you're going to be doing those checks more often. Now, if you fail it, you lose focus on that spell ends, but you don't lose that spell, assuming that you did successfully cast it initially. Unless you roll a nat 1. If you critically fail on a focus check, you treat it as if you critically failed on casting the spell, which means a priest will still have to do its penance, and a wizard still rolls on the mishap table, and you can't cast that spell again. So it is a bit riskier to cast focus spells on this, but you know, it's the price you pay for being able to do some pretty powerful magic. Now, I had mentioned bards earlier, and where they come into the conversation as far as spell casting is with scrolls and wands. So only priests, wizards, and bards can use scrolls and wands. Wizards can only use scrolls and wands that have wizard spells in them, and priests can only use scrolls and wands that have priest spells in them. But a bard can use any scroll and any wand. Using a scroll is almost the exact same as just casting a spell. You make your spellcasting check. If it succeeds, you cast the spell. If it fails, you don't cast the spell. Either way, you only get one use of a scroll and it disappears afterwards. If you roll a nat 1 on a scroll, though, you still have to roll on your mishap table if you're a wizard. A priest gets a freebie if they roll a nat 1, because if you fail, the scroll's gone anyway, but it doesn't affect your known spells. So even if a priest were to roll a nat 1 on a scroll, even if they know the spell that's on the scroll, it doesn't affect their spell. So it's a little safer to use scrolls as a priest, but not that big of a deal. And to be completely honest, wizards likely aren't going to be using too many scrolls, because scrolls are where wizards have the potential of becoming very powerful. Wizards have the ability to spend a day studying a scroll, and then they get to make an intelligence check to permanently learn that spell. And why I say this can make wizards really strong is because the only resource you have for how many spells you can cast in a day is essentially how many spells you know. There are no prepared spells or anything. It's just how many spells do you know. So if a wizard knows 50 spells, they could fail 50 checks, which really makes wizards the more powerful spellcaster. So I'll put the table on here that shows how many spells wizards learn and priests learn. Wizards already know more spells than priests, which is an obvious advantage or buff. And then their ability to learn spells from scrolls makes them a lot stronger, at least gives them the potential to be a lot stronger, especially in the later parts of the game. Now, I will say that it is a DC 15 intelligence check to learn a spell. Not a spellcasting check, an intelligence check. So any of those modifiers or additions to your spellcasting checks don't apply. It is just a flat intelligence check to learn a spell. Most wizards that have been in my game usually have around a +4 to their intelligence, which means that's a 50-50 shot on if they're going to learn it or not. And if they fail that check, scroll disappears. Now, the only real difference between wands and scrolls is wands you can often use multiple times, but if you roll a nat 1 on it, your wand will break, and you still roll on the mishap table. Bards can cast any spell from a scroll or a wand. It doesn't matter if it's a priest spell or a wizard spell. For all of them, they will use charisma as their spellcasting check. So that makes bards pretty versatile and a little unique because they can cast both wizards and priest spells if they have the scrolls or wands to do so. Which ironically means that bards would probably be one of the best wand users. But yeah, it's whatever. Something that isn't really clear is what it says on there. It says on a critical failure, casters with mishap tables must roll on a mishap table. Now, bards don't have any spells that they can just learn to be able to cast. They can only cast through scrolls and wands, and they don't have a mishap table. The mishap table might only apply to wizards, but the Dungeon Master may rule that if you're casting a wizard spell, you roll on the wizard mishap table. My interpretation of it, though, would be that the character doesn't have a mishap table, so they wouldn't have to roll on the mishap table. But ultimately, that's up to each group and table to decide for themselves, I suppose. Now, is this the best spellcasting system out there? Maybe, maybe not. I'll say it's my favorite. I like the unpredictability and chaotic nature of Magic with this system because sometimes spellcasters feel really, really strong. And then other times, they don't. And it's fun to see some of the players kind of role-playing, especially when they're talking smack about the spells that they can cast and just going through some fun player role-play, and then they fail to cast the spell, then they can't cast it again all day. It's created some interesting moments, which I enjoy. A few other things to know, though. With something like 5e, it's very consistent what you're going to be getting out of your spellcasters, even Pathfinder, because you have to set up what spells you're going to be using, and then that's what you get to use, or you have a certain amount of spell slots that you can use. It's very consistent and predictable what spellcasters are going to be able to do. So with this, it takes that predictability, that consistency out, and it really makes Magic feel more chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous, especially with the mishap tables. And so I personally love this Magic system.